Chapter 1. The New Tenants. The slam of a door echoed through the empty street, rattling the windows of the old Victorian house like a final warning. A man, tall and red-faced with frustration, stormed down the crumbling steps, his wife and 2 children trailing behind him. They looked dishevelled, eyes dark with sleeplessness, their limbs dotted with angry red welts. "Will you call this a house?" the man shouted over his shoulder, his voice sharp with rage. He stomped across the overgrown lawn, pointing at the owner, Mr. Hastings, who stood on the curb, bewildered and sweating in his cheap suit. "It's infested. My wife can't sleep. My kids are getting bitten every night, and you're doing nothing." Mr. Hastings ran a hand through his thinning hair, his eyes darting from the departing family to the looming shadow of the house behind them. Its windows, black and blank, seemed to stare back at him. He had heard it all before. The complaints, the accusations, the threats to sue. This was the 5th family to leave in as many months, and the pattern was always the same. Mysterious bites on their hands, ankles, legs and faces, appearing overnight and growing worse by the day. "I've had the house sprayed twice," Mr. Hastings insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "I've hired cleaners, fumigators. There's no infestation, I swear. If you just give it a chance." The man didn't even look back. "We're done. You can keep your damned house. We'll see you in court." As the family piled into their car, slamming doors and revving the engine angrily, Mr. Hastings sighed. He turned back to the house, scratching at his neck where he imagined phantom bites. The ivy clung to its brickwork like skeletal fingers, and the porch sagged as if weary of the burden it carried. With a resigned sigh, he climbed the steps and unlocked the door. The hinges creaked like the whisper of an old secret, and the stale air inside greeted him, thick with the scent of dust and neglect. Mr. Hastings wrinkled his nose, striding through the rooms, flicking on lights that buzzed dimly. He checked every corner, every crevice, half expecting to see a swarm of insects or rats scattering at his approach, but the house remained still, almost too quiet. "Damn thing spotless," he muttered to himself, though he knew it didn't matter. The reputation was already there, spreading through the neighbourhood like a plague. No one wanted a cursed house, no matter how cheap the rent. 3 days later, Mr. Hastings found himself at the same door, this time with a new family in tow, the Ramirez family, young, hopeful, and desperate for a deal. Mr. Hastings put on his best smile as he turned the key, pushing open the door with a flourish. "It's got a lot of character," he said, ushering them inside. "Solid bones, too. Built in the 1800s. You can't find craftsmanship like this anymore." Mrs. Ramirez, a petite woman with a warm smile, nodded approvingly as she ran her fingers along the wooden banister. Her husband, a tall, broad-shouldered man, lifted their youngest daughter into his arms, while their older child, a boy of about 10, hung back, eyeing the dark corners of the house with mild suspicion. "It's lovely," Mrs. Ramirez said, her eyes scanning the high ceilings and ornate mouldings. "I'm surprised it's still on the market." Mr. Hastings cleared his throat, smoothing down his jacket. "Well, some folks are superstitious, you know. Old houses have their quirks, but I assure you, it's all nonsense. Nothing that can't be fixed with a little TLC." They nodded along, more interested in the price than the history. After a brief negotiation, Mr. Hastings handed over the keys, and the Ramirez family began to settle in. Mr. Hastings promised to send over a cleaning crew and an exterminator, just in case. That night, the Ramirez family settled into their new home. The children's laughter filled the halls as they explored every nook and cranny, and for a while, The house seemed to breathe with life again, but when the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the rooms, the air grew heavy and still. In the master bedroom, Mr. and Mrs. Ramirez were unpacking boxes, chatting softly about their plans for the house. Their youngest daughter, Emily, was already asleep, tucked in with her stuffed rabbit. Mateo, their son, was in his room, lying on his bed with one foot dangling off the edge as he scrolled through his tablet. The first bite came just before midnight. Mateo jolted awake, a sharp sting burning his ankle. He reached down, rubbing at the spot and frowning at the two swollen red welts that had appeared out of nowhere. "Mom," Mateo called, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "I think something bit me." His mother appeared at the door, rubbing her eyes. "Probably a mosquito, honey. We'll get some bug spray tomorrow." But Mateo wasn't convinced. The bites throbbed painfully, too large and angry to be just mosquitoes. He glanced around the room, searching the dim corners. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he caught a glimpse of something that made his breath hitch. A shadow, darker than the rest. Just for a moment in the corner of his eye, it seemed to flicker, almost as if it were watching him. "Mum, there's something." But when he turned fully, the shadow was gone. His mother kissed his forehead and promised to call the landlord in the morning. Mateo nodded, but as he lay back down, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, hidden somewhere in the dark. The night crept on, and the house settled into a deep silence, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood and the soft scurry of something unseen. As the family slept, a faint scratching began in the attic above, like tiny claws on wood, almost imperceptible beneath the rustling of leaves outside. In her room, little Emily stirred, her small face scrunching up as if in a dream. A soft whisper drifted through the air, so quiet it was almost mist, a child's voice, gentle and inviting. "Come play," it seemed to say, and in the corner, where the light didn't quite reach, the shadow of a boy flickered just out of sight. The Ramirez family awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside, the sun peeking through the heavy curtains that framed the dusty windows. But their morning peace was short-lived. As the first rays of light filled the rooms, the family's expressions turned from groggy to startled, and then to a growing sense of unease. Each of them bore the same strange marks, 2 small, swollen bites, some on their hands, others on their legs, and even a few on the back of their necks. They inspected each other with a mix of bewilderment and irritation, exchanging glances that quickly morphed into concern. "What the hell is this?" Mr. Ramirez grumbled, rubbing at the fresh bites on his forearm. "We just moved in. This can't be happening already." Mrs. Ramirez's patience was already wearing thin. She was examining a pair of bites on her own leg, each swollen and red. She glanced at her husband, her expression and stern. "This is unacceptable. I knew this place was old, but this..." She gestured to the welts on her hands and arms. "This isn't normal. I'm calling the landlord." The kids sat at the kitchen table, eating cereal in subdued silence. Mateo, still drowsy, scratched absently at the 2 bites on his ankle. Emily, who had a matching set on her wrist, didn't seem to mind at all. She was humming softly, swinging her legs as she stared out the window, her expression oddly serene. Mrs. Ramirez stormed into the hallway, phone in hand, and dialed Mr. Hastings with a sense of urgency. When he answered, she launched into her complaint without preamble. "Mr. Hastings, this is unacceptable. We've all been bitten, every single one of us. There are bugs or mosquitoes or something, and I want it fixed today. If you can't handle this, we'll find somewhere else to live. You promised us a clean house." Mr. Hastings, who had been quietly sipping his morning coffee and hoping for an uneventful day, listened in stunned silence. He pulled at his collar, feeling the warmth of anxiety creeping up his neck. "Mrs. Ramirez, I assure you, I had the place cleaned top to bottom. There shouldn't be any bugs, and the exterminator said—" "I don't care what the exterminator said," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "You need to come over here and see for yourself. If you don't fix this, we're not paying another cent." Mr. Hastings sighed, reluctantly agreeing. He hung up the phone, gathered his things, and made his way to the house, a sinking feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. When Mr. Hastings arrived, the Ramirez family was waiting, their expressions a mix of frustration and exhaustion. Mrs. Ramirez wasted no time showing him the bites, pointing out each mark with a sense of vindication. "You see," she said, her voice tight, "we didn't sign up for this. If this doesn't get sorted, we're gone." Mr. Hastings nodded, attempting to maintain his composure. He rolled up his sleeves and set to work, moving methodically through each room, checking every corner, closet, and crevice. He crouched low, squinting at the baseboards, tapping walls and peering behind old furniture. He even pulled a flashlight from his pocket to inspect the darker spots, where light barely reached. Nothing. There was no sign of insects, no trails of bugs, no nests or cobwebs that might explain the bites. The house, as far as Mr. Hastings could tell, was clean. "It's strange," he muttered, almost to himself. "There's nothing here. I've had this place sprayed twice in the past month. There should be nothing left alive." Mrs. Ramirez folded her arms, unimpressed. "Well, something's here. We all have the bites to prove it." As Mr. Hastings finished his inspection, he turned to the children, who were sitting quietly on the couch. Mateo was still scratching his bites, but Emily was smiling, her attention fixed on something distant. She looked up at Mr. Hastings, her eyes bright and oddly cheerful. "I like it here," she said, her voice light and innocent. "I don't care about the bites. They don't hurt too much. It's nice, I have a friend." Mr. Hastings frowned, glancing at Mrs. Ramirez, who gave a worried look. "A friend?" he asked, trying to keep his tone gentle. "Who's your friend?" Emily giggled, swinging her feet as she glanced toward the hallway. "The boy in the attic. He says it's okay. He says the bites are just his way of saying hello." Mrs. Ramirez paled, reaching out to touch her daughter's arm. "Emily, sweetheart, there's no boy in the attic. You're just imagining things." Emily simply shrugged, still smiling. "Maybe, but he's nice. He said he'd help keep us safe." Mr. Hastings forced a chuckle, though his heart was pounding. He straightened up, wiping his brow. "Kids and their imaginations," he said nervously, glancing at the front door. "Well, I'll have another exterminator come by just to be safe. I'm sure we'll sort this out. He moved toward the door, ready to leave and escape the mounting discomfort that was settling in his gut, but when he reached for the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. He frowned, jiggling the handle, but it remained stubbornly locked. "What the—" Mr. Hastings mumbled, trying again, harder this time. The door remained immovable, as if bolted shut from the outside. He glanced back at the Ramirez family, forcing in a strained smile. Just a stuck door, no problem. But when he pulled again, the doorknob turned freely in his hand, yet the door itself stayed firmly in place. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Mrs. Ramirez stood up, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice edged with a sudden wariness. "It's nothing," Mr. Hastings said, but his voice wavered. He moved to the windows, trying to lift one then another, but they, too, refused to open. Each pane of glass seemed sealed shut, as if fused into the frames. Mr. Ramirez joined him, pushing on a window with all his strength. It didn't budge. They tried another, and then another, but every window in the house remained sealed. The once stale air now felt oppressive, the walls closing in around them. "This isn't right," Mr. Ramirez muttered, his voice tight with unease. He pounded on the glass, but it gave no response, as though the house itself had decided to hold them captive. Mr. Hastings' face drained of colour. He tugged at his collar, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on him, suffocating. The once quiet scratching in the attic began to echo faintly through the walls, growing louder, almost like whispers. "Let us out," Mrs. Ramirez demanded, panic creeping into her voice. "This isn't funny." Mr. Hastings fumbled with his keys, trying to unlock the front door again, but the lock wouldn't turn. The whispers grew louder, like children giggling behind a curtain, their voices playful yet mocking. Emily sat calmly on the couch, watching the adults struggle, her eyes fixed on the dark corners of the room. She tilted her head as if listening, then smiled softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He doesn't want you to leave." Mr. Hastings knelt down in front of Emily, his expression strained as he tried to mask the fear that gnawed at him. He glanced over his shoulder, where Mr. Ramirez was still yanking furiously at the front door, his face flushed with exertion. The sound of heavy breathing filled the hallway, mingling with the faint scratching noise that seemed to drift down from the attic above. "Emily," Mr. Hastings said softly, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm. "Can you tell me more about the boy, the one in the attic?" Emily's eyes sparkled with a mischievous light, her small face completely unfazed by the tension that gripped the adults. She hugged her stuffed rabbit closer and nodded. "He's nice," she said simply. "He doesn't like it when people leave. He wants us to stay. He likes having friends." Mr. Hastings swallowed hard, a chill running down his spine. "And he's the one who, bites?" Emily giggled, her innocent laughter sending a shiver through Mr. Hastings. "He's just playing. He said it's how he shares." Mr. Ramirez grunted, yanking on the door handle one more time. His knuckles were white, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead. "What the hell does that mean?" he snapped, frustration boiling over. "This is insane. We have to get out of here." Mrs. Ramirez placed a hand on her husband's arm, her own fear evident in her wide eyes. "Let's just figure this out," she whispered, though her voice shook. Mr. Hastings, desperate to regain some semblance of control, stood up and adjusted his jacket. He forced a smile, though his eyes darted nervously to the locked door. "I'm just going to step outside for a moment," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'll get the cleaner, maybe some more bug spray. I'll be right back, I promise." As if on cue, the front door suddenly clicked open. The windows, which had been sealed shut just moments before, creaked ajar, letting in a rush of cool air. Mr. Hastings didn't hesitate. He bolted through the doorway, stumbling down the steps with a hurried shout. "I'll get help," he called over his shoulder, already halfway to his car. His voice faded quickly as he disappeared around the corner, the sound of his footsteps lost to the thick silence that settled over the house once more. Inside, the Ramirez family stood in stunned silence, their gazes fixed on the now open door. Mrs. Ramirez turned to Emily, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "Emily, sweetie, is this all real? Are you sure you're not just imagining things?" Emily shook her head, her face serene as she gazed up at her mother. "It's real, Mama. He's real. And he doesn't want us to go. He likes it when we stay." Mr. Ramirez rubbed his temples, pacing the length of the hallway as if trying to shake off the strangeness that clung to the air. "This is crazy," he muttered. "There's no boy. It's just a story, just her imagination." But as he spoke, a sudden noise echoed from upstairs, a rapid, heavy pattering, like footsteps racing across the wooden floor above. The family froze, their eyes snapping upward. The sound was unmistakable, the quick, playful running of a child, darting from room to room. Though no one was there, Mr. Ramirez grabbed a broom, gripping it tightly as he edged towards the staircase. He looked back at his wife and children, his face set in a determined frown. "Stay here," he said, though his own voice wavered. "I'm going to check it out." He ascended the stairs slowly, each creak of the old wood amplifying the tension that hung heavy in the house. When he reached the top, he found nothing. The hallway was empty, the doors to the bedrooms slightly ajar, but there was no sign of movement, no shadow, no boy, just the lingering sound of footsteps, now fading into an eerie quiet. Downstairs, Mrs. Ramirez hugged Emily tightly, her heart racing. She exchanged a worried glance with Mateo, who was clutching his tablet as if it could offer some kind of protection. "It's okay," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "We'll figure this out." The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervousness. They tried to go about their routine, cooking, cleaning, and unpacking the last of their boxes, but every sound, every creak and whisper set them on edge. The house felt alive with a presence they couldn't see but could sense in every darkened corner. As evening fell, the family gathered in the living room, the atmosphere tense and uneasy. They locked the doors and closed the windows, drawing the curtains tight. Shadows stretched across the walls, flickering in the dim light of a single lamp. They spoke little, their eyes darting to the ceiling every time the faintest noise drifted down from the attic. When night finally settled in, the house seemed to hold its breath. The wind outside picked up, rustling the leaves and sending faint whispers through the cracks in the old wood. In their respective rooms, the Ramirez family tried to sleep, though rest was elusive, the silence pressing down like a weight. The bites came again, just past midnight. Mr. Ramirez was the first to feel it, a sharp, stinging pain on his calf. He jolted awake, wincing as he rubbed at the fresh bites. 2 marks, red and swollen, identical to the ones from the night before. He glanced at his wife, who was already sitting up, rubbing her arm where a matching pair of bites had appeared. "What the hell is going on?" Mr. Ramirez whispered, his voice edged with desperation. He swung his legs over the bed, peering into the dark corners of the room. His breath hitched as he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow flickering just beyond the reach of the lamp's light, there and gone in a blink. In the hallway, Mateo shuffled toward his parents' room, his face pale and eyes wide. "I got bit again," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. His ankle bore 2 fresh welts, and he scratched at them absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on the shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. Emily, however, remained in her bed, unfazed by the bites that dotted her wrists and neck. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes following something unseen. She whispered softly, as if speaking to someone only she could hear. "Do you see him?" she asked, her voice echoing faintly. "He's just saying hello." The air grew colder, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the house once more, running along the upstairs hallway. The shadows deepened, pooling in the corners and stretching along the floor, shapes shifting like liquid darkness. Mr. Ramirez turned on every light he could find, but the bulbs flickered and dimmed, casting an unsteady glow that did little to banish the creeping dread. The family huddled together, their breaths shallow and quick, eyes darting to the slightest movement. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, they saw it, a shadow, small and childlike, lingering near the base of the stairs. It shifted slightly, almost as if watching them. For a moment, the outline of a boy seemed to materialize, just a flicker of form in the darkness. Then, with a soft whisper of movement, it faded back into the shadows, leaving only the sound of quiet, playful laughter echoing in the silence. The bites throbbed, the pain pulsing in time with the beating of their hearts, and as the Ramirez family huddled together, the house seemed to close in around them, its walls pressing tight, as if embracing them with the cold, unyielding grip of the unseen boy who called this place home. The thick fog rolled through the cobblestone streets of London, clinging to the narrow alleyways like a suffocating shroud. It was a dark, moonless night in the late 1800s, and the gas lamps cast a dim, wavering light that did little to banish the shadows lurking at every corner. Amidst the murky gloom, a young boy sprinted, his thin frame darting through the mist like a phantom. His name was Oliver, a street urchin no older than 12, with matted hair and clothes that hung off him in tattered rags. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, eyes wide with terror as he glanced back over his shoulder. Behind him, the heavy footfalls of 2 angry men echoed, their voices cutting through the fog. "There he is, the little thief," one of the men bellowed, his face twisted in fury. "Oh, you'll pay for that, boy. We'll beat your hands so you can't steal no more." Oliver's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't stolen anything from them, but that didn't matter. In the harsh streets of London, being a beggar meant you were always guilty, always the target. He could still hear their threats, feel the sting of the cobblestones beneath his bare feet. As he ran, "It wasn't me!" Oliver shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "I swear, I didn't do it." But the men were relentless, their shouts growing louder as they closed the gap. They were larger, stronger, and Oliver knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He darted down a narrow alley, his small frame slipping through gaps too tight for his pursuers. But as he reached the end, his heart sank. It was a dead end. Oliver turned, pressing his back against the cold, damp wall. The men stalked forward, cruel smiles stretching across their faces as they cornered him. "Got you now, you little rat," one of them sneered, cracking his knuckles. "We'll teach you to keep your hands to yourself." Oliver's eyes welled with tears. He pressed himself harder against the wall, wishing he could disappear into the stone. "Please, I didn't take anything. Please." The men advanced, their expressions darkening with the thrill of impending violence. Just as the first man reached out to grab Oliver, a calm, commanding voice cut through the night. "Leave the boy alone." The men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. At the mouth of the alley stood a man, tall and imposing, dressed in the finest gentleman's attire. A black cape draped over his broad shoulders, and a top hat sat atop his head. His face was sharp and pale, with eyes that glimmered faintly in the dim light. He carried himself with an air of undeniable authority, his presence both magnetic and terrifying. The men exchanged a quick, nervous glance, the fight instantly draining from their stance. "Sorry, sir," one of them stammered, backing away from Oliver. "We didn't mean any harm, just a bit of street justice, that's all." The gentleman smiled, but it was a cold, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Leaving so soon? How rude to depart before dinner." Before the men could respond, the gentleman's features shifted, his smile stretching impossibly wide to reveal a set of long, gleaming fangs. His eyes flared a deep, menacing red. The men tried to scream, but it was too late. The gentleman moved with a speed that defied belief, a blur of motion that left the men gasping and writhing in the street as he drained the life from them in mere moments. Oliver watched, frozen in place, his breath catching in his throat. The sounds of the men's struggles faded quickly, their bodies collapsing to the ground, lifeless and pale. The gentleman was straightened, dabbing at the corners of his mouth with a crisp, white handkerchief. He turned to Oliver, his expression shifting to one of mild amusement. "Can you keep a secret, boy?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. Or do I need to do the same to you? Oliver shook, tears streaming down his cheeks. I won't tell. I promise. I won't tell anyone. The gentleman chuckled, a low, velvety sound that sent a shiver down Oliver's spine. Of course you won't, he said, his form shimmering before fading into the shadows like smoke on the wind. Oliver remained rooted to the spot, staring at the empty alleyway, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He slowly walked forward, stepping over the bodies of the men who had threatened him. As he emerged from the alley, he felt a weight in his pocket. He reached in and pulled out a small, heavy purse filled with coins. A smile tugged at his lips. He had taken it from the gentleman during the chaos, a skillful lift that even he hadn't realized he'd made. He tucked the purse away and hurried down the foggy street, the thrill of his newfound wealth pushing aside the lingering dread. But, as he weaved through the mist, a voice whispered from the darkness. Clever boy. I didn't even see you take it. Oliver froze, his blood running cold. The gentleman emerged from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and hunger. Oliver stammered, holding out the purse. It dropped, sir. I was just going to find you to give it back. The gentleman smiled, revealing his fangs once more. Now, no need for lies. I was praising you. It takes skill to steal from me, but steal you did. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching long and dark across the cobblestones. So now I must punish you. Oliver's heart raced, and he backed away, shaking his head furiously. No, please, I didn't mean to. The gentleman's expression shifted to one of cold calculation. Punishment need not be so primitive, not for one with your talents. Before Oliver could react, the gentleman was upon him, faster than a blink. He felt a sharp pain at his neck, the gentleman's fangs piercing his skin. The world spun, darkness closing in from all sides as the life drained from him, his senses fading to black. When Oliver awoke, he was no longer the scared, frail boy who had run through the fog that night. He lay on the cold, damp ground, but everything felt different, sharper, clearer. His senses were heightened to an unbearable degree. He could hear the faintest whisper of wind through the cracks in the stone, see every minute detail of the brick wall in front of him. Even in the darkness, his body felt strong, powerful, and a strange hunger gnawed at his insides, unlike anything he had ever known. It wasn't a hunger for food. It was something deeper, more primal. He rose to his feet, the alley suddenly seeming smaller, the world around him more vibrant and terrifying. Oliver licked his lips, tasting the lingering metallic tang of his own blood. His senses were alive, electrified, his mind flooded with 1,000 thoughts all at once. He felt invincible, yet cursed, powerful yet trapped within this new, unending hunger. The fog still clung to the London streets, and as Oliver stepped into the night, he realized that he too now belonged to the shadows, a new creature of the dark, cursed to wander, unseen and unheard, feeding off the life of others to sustain his own eternal existence. The boy who had once begged for scraps in the streets was gone. In his place stood something far older, far more dangerous, a shadow, forever lurking, forever hungry. And though the gentleman had vanished, Oliver knew he would never be truly alone. The darkness was his companion now, his teacher, and his endless hunger would drive him forward, through the fog and into the unknown. The next morning, Mr. Hastings returned to the old Victorian house, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. He arrived promptly at 10 a.m., a grim determination in his step. By his side was a tall, gaunt man with a sharp, hawk-like face and piercing eyes that seemed to see through the very walls. He wore a dark overcoat, and his presence, carried an unsettling air of authority and mystery. The man's name was Sebastian Grey, a renowned clairvoyant and hunter of the supernatural. As soon as Mr. Hastings and Sebastian entered the house, they were met by the Ramirez family, who erupted in a chorus of anger and panic. "This is insane," Mrs. Ramirez shouted, pointing to the fresh bites on her arms and legs. "The bites are getting worse every night. We can't live like this. We're leaving today." Mr. Ramirez stepped forward, his face red with fury. "You promised this place was safe. We won't spend another night here. We want our money back, and we're done with this nightmare." Mr. Hastings, his patience fraying, raised his voice in a tone sharper than anyone had heard from him before. "You hear that, boy?" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the house. "We're all leaving, and I swear I'll make sure no one ever comes here again." As if in response, the house reacted violently. The front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the windows rattled and locked themselves tight. The once still air grew thick, almost suffocating, and a cold draft swept through the rooms, sending a shiver down everyone's spine. Sebastian Grey merely smiled, unfazed by the sudden display of supernatural defiance. He turned to Mr. Hastings with a knowing look. "Interesting?" he mused, his voice calm and analytical. "Yes, it could well be what I suspected." Mr. Hastings, still shaking, introduced Sebastian with a nervous nod. "This is Mr. Grey. He's a clairvoyant and a hunter of supernaturals. He'll get to the bottom of this." Sebastian approached the Ramirez family, his gaze lingering on each of them before settling on Emily, who was clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. He then turned his attention to the bite marks on their skin, examining them with a keen, practiced eye. "You mentioned that the entity is of shadow form?" Sebastian asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and certainty. Mrs. Ramirez nodded, her expression torn between fear and confusion. "Yes, we've seen glimpses. Just shadows, nothing solid. But the bites, they're real." Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly as he nodded to himself. "Then we could be dealing with an elder," he explained. "Or, as many prefer to call them, a vampire. The bites are how he drains blood, though at a lesser amount than most. He's likely small, perhaps a child. A young elder wouldn't need to drain as much to survive. He's probably been hiding in this house for years, unseen and undetected." The family watched in silence as Sebastian opened his worn leather bag, pulling out a massive, industrial-grade torch. He flicked the switch, and the torch burst to life, flooding the entire room with an intense, blinding light. "No space for shadows with this," Sebastian said, his voice cool and confident. He reached into his bag again and pulled out several sharp, stake-like weapons, handing one to Mr. and Mrs. Ramirez, and another to Mr. Hastings. The stakes were made of dark, polished wood, each tip gleaming with a silver point. "Once he's trapped by the light," Sebastian instructed, his tone turning serious, "we just need to stab him with these. It will be enough to destroy him, even in his shadow form." As the adults prepared for the confrontation, Emily burst into tears, her voice breaking as she pleaded with them. "No, please," she cried, clutching her rabbit tighter. "He's not hurting anyone. He's scared and alone. He's been here for years, hiding because of the tall man. He's afraid to go outside. Please don't hurt him." Sebastian's gaze softened slightly, but only for a moment. "I'm sorry, child," he said quietly. "This is the only way." Ignoring Emily's pleas, the adults moved toward the staircase that led to the attic. The torch's beam cut through the dimness, illuminating every shadowed corner as they ascended the creaking steps. The air grew colder, the oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the faint, rhythmic beating of their hearts. As they neared the attic door, a soft, Pitiful whimpering reached their ears, a sound that sent a chill down their spines. It was the sound of a boy, crying in fear, echoing through the wooden beams above. "We have him," Sebastian whispered, his voice tight with anticipation. He adjusted his grip on the torch, directing its beam toward the attic entrance. The light flared, casting sharp, unyielding rays that banished the darkness from the hallway. Mrs. Ramirez hesitated, her hand trembling as she clutched the stake. "Are we sure about this?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "He's just a child." Sebastian's expression hardened. "He's not just a child. He's a predator, an elder, and if we don't stop him now, he'll never stop feeding." They pushed open the attic door, the wood groaning in protest. The light from Sebastian's torch poured into the attic, sweeping over old, dusty boxes and forgotten relics of the past. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the furthest corners of the room, but there, crouched behind an ancient trunk, was the shape of a boy, small, frail, and shrouded in shadow. His eyes, wide and filled with terror, glinted faintly in the harsh light. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "Don't hurt me." Sebastian stepped forward, his grip on the torch steady. "It's over," he said, his voice echoing through the attic. "You can't hide anymore." The boy's form flickered, trying to meld with the shadows that the light chased away. He whimpered, his small body trembling. Emily's cries grew louder, her voice desperate and heartbroken. "Please, no," she sobbed. "He's scared. He just wants to be left alone." But the adults pressed on, their movements deliberate and unyielding. They surrounded the boy, the stakes ready, their hearts pounding with the mix of fear and resolve. The boy's whimpers turned to sobs, the sound of a child lost and alone, caught between the world of the living and the curse of the undead. Mr. Hastings hesitated, the stake in his hand suddenly feeling heavy. "Sebastian, are we sure?" "We don't have a choice," Sebastian cut in, his eyes fixed on the trembling form of the boy. "Do it now." With the torch's light bearing down, the boy let out one final, heartbreaking cry, a sound of pure, desperate fear. And then, as the adults moved in, the shadows rippled and twisted, the air growing cold and thick with the weight of what was to come. As the adults moved closer to the boy, stakes poised and ready to strike, the temperature in the attic plummeted, and the air turned bitterly cold. A fierce wind roared through the house, rattling the walls and shattering windows with an explosive force. Doors flew open with violent bangs, and the whole structure seemed to shudder as the wind howled, climbing the stairs like an unseen beast on the hunt. "Stay back," Sebastian Grey shouted, his voice strained as he aimed the powerful torch at the doorway, trying to pierce through the thickening darkness. The wind whipped around him, relentless, as if trying to tear the light from his hands. "It's another one of them. A big one," he yelled over the noise, his eyes darting around the attic in search of the unseen threat. Suddenly, a flash of silver cut through the air. A knife, sleek and deadly, flew with blinding speed, smashing into the torch and shattering its bulb. The room plunged into darkness, the blinding light snuffed out in an instant. In the doorway stood a figure, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the moonlight, filtering through the shattered windows. She was tall, elegant, and unmistakably menacing, her presence exuding a quiet, lethal power. The moon's glint caught her features for a moment, revealing the pale, cold beauty of Seranna, a female elder whose reputation was whispered in fearful tones, even among her kind. "Not so brave now, are we?" Seranna's voice was smooth, almost mocking, her eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light as she surveyed the room. Mr. Hastings, Mr. Grey, and the Ramirez family froze, the stakes trembling in their hands. The fierce wind seemed to bow to Seranna, swirling around her as if she commanded the very elements. She turned her gaze to Oliver, who had been cowering behind the trunk, his shadowy form still flickering in the dim light. "Come to me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Oliver obeyed without question, stepping out from his hiding place and crossing the attic to her side. He looked up at her with wide eyes, his face filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Seranna looked down at him, her expression softening for a moment. "I have been searching for you for so long, young one," she said, brushing a lock of matted hair from his forehead. "The boy elder, so rare, so elusive. You can thank Grey here for leading me straight to you. He leaves very big footprints." Sebastian Grey's face twisted with frustration and anger, but he held his ground, his eyes locked on Seranna. He knew better than to challenge her directly. She was an elder of great power, far beyond the simple shadow tricks of a young vampire like Oliver. Seranna turned her gaze back to the humans, her expression shifting to one of cold calculation. "Now, Oliver," she said, her voice a soft purr filled with dark promise, "do we finish them off, or let them live?" Oliver hesitated, glancing between the terrified faces of the Ramirez family and Mr. Hastings, and the cool, unwavering stare of Sebastian Grey. His eyes lingered on Emily, who stood at the back of the group, her small frame shaking, but her eyes filled with a pleading sadness. Oliver's lips curved into a small smile. "I like her," he said simply, pointing to Emily. Seranna tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered his response. A faint smile played at the edges of her lips. "Live, then," she declared, her voice echoing with finality. With a graceful flick of her wrist, Seranna merged into the shadows, her form dissolving into the darkness like smoke on the wind. Oliver followed her lead, his small figure melting away into the inky blackness, leaving no trace of their presence behind. The attic fell silent, save for the faint creak of settling wood and the whisper of the cold wind that had begun to die down. The Ramirez family, Mr. Hastings and Mr. Grey, stood in stunned silence, the stakes still clutched in their hands, useless against the overwhelming power that had just confronted them. It was Mr. Hastings who finally broke the silence, his voice oddly calm, almost relieved. "Well," he said, straightening his jacket and brushing off the dust, "that finally takes care of that problem. The house is most definitely clear of bugs." He glanced at the Ramirez family, who were still pale and shaken. "Make sure the rent is paid on time." Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and marched down the stairs, his footsteps echoing hollowly through the empty house. Sebastian Grey followed, his expression a mix of frustration and grudging respect for the elders he'd encountered. As the front door slammed shut behind them, the family was left standing in the dim attic, the weight of what they had just witnessed pressing down like an unbearable burden. The shadows no longer flickered with a life of their own, and the wind had stilled, leaving only the cold chill of the night. Emily clutched her rabbit tightly, her eyes fixed on the spot where Oliver had stood. She could still feel the connection, the unspoken understanding that had passed between them in those final moments. She knew, deep down, that Oliver was not truly gone, and that somewhere in the shadows he watched, waiting and listening. As they made their way down from the attic, the Ramirez family clung to each other, their steps slow and uncertain. They had come face to face with the darkness, and though they had been spared, they knew the house would never truly be theirs. The elders had marked it as their own, and in the quiet of the night, the walls seemed to whisper of secrets that would never be told. But for now, the shadows had receded, and the boy elder had found his place once more, hidden in the depths of the night, forever a part of the house that had been his refuge. And as the moonlight streamed through the broken windows, the Ramirez family understood one thing. They were not alone, and the house would never be empty again. The night had grown deeper, the moon hanging low and full in the sky, casting its pale light over the sprawling, abandoned manor where Seranna had led Oliver. They entered through a hidden side door, and the ancient wood groaned under their steps, echoing through the vast, empty halls. Oliver's eyes darted around, taking in the grand but decaying surroundings, the high vaulted ceilings, the faded tapestries, and the lingering scent of dust and time. In the grand foyer, a figure waited for them. Tall and imposing, with silver hair that flowed down his back, and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries, Eldur stood with an air of quiet command. He wore a finely tailored suit, black as midnight, and his presence filled the room with an almost tangible energy. As Oliver stepped forward, he couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and apprehension. There was something about Eldur that was both deeply comforting and profoundly intimidating. Oliver swallowed hard, his voice small as he looked up at the powerful elder. "Are you a god, Mr. Elder?" Eldur's lips curled into a gentle, amused smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I was once, in my journey to find myself," he replied, his voice rich and resonant. "But on that journey, I found something far more powerful than gods." He glanced at Seranna, who stood at his side with a quiet, knowing smile, her eyes reflecting a light that spoke of ancient secrets and shared histories. Eldur continued, his gaze returning to Oliver. "I always remember a quote I heard long ago, perhaps from Eldritch. Seeking God and finding himself. I don't recall exactly where it came from, but it certainly rings true, don't you think?" Oliver nodded, though he didn't fully understand. There was a warmth in Eldur's words, a promise of belonging that Oliver had never felt before. He had spent his life as a shadow, a ghost of the streets, always hiding, always running. But here, in this moment, he felt seen. Eldur knelt down, his expression softening. "Now, little one, we have heard much about you, the little gnat, buzzing through the ages." He chuckled, the sound rich and deep. "But you no longer have to be a bug, Oliver. Now you are a prince." Oliver blinked up at him, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Are you going to be my parents?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I never had parents." Eldur exchanged a look with Seranna, a silent conversation passing between them. He nodded slowly, reaching out to place a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "Yes, I suppose we are," Eldur said, his tone gentle. "But our family is not complete yet. There is another we must save, one who will soon be like a sister to you, but we cannot reach her without your help." Oliver furrowed his brow, confusion flickering in his eyes. "But you're so powerful," he said. "Why do you need me?" Eldur smiled, a glint of wisdom and kindness shining through his ancient eyes. "Power is a curious thing, Oliver. What good is the mightiest strength when the target cannot be found? What use is power when it's wielded alone, against enemies you cannot see or catch? Like a flea, elusive and quick, slipping through even the tightest grip." Seranna stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "We all have power, little one, each of us in our own ways. It is only when we come together, when we combine our strengths and work as one, that true power is achieved." Eldur nodded in agreement, his gaze steady on Oliver. "Your gift, your ability to move unseen, to slip into the shadows where others cannot follow, that is something neither Seranna nor I can do. You, Oliver, are the key. You will help us find her, your new sister." Oliver glanced between Eldur and Seranna, the weight of their words settling in his young heart. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose beyond survival. He was no longer just a boy, scrounging for scraps and hiding from the cruel world outside. He was part of something bigger, a family unlike any he had ever known. "Okay," Oliver said, his voice small but resolute. "I'll help. I'll do whatever I can." Eldur's smile broadened, and he rose to his full height, extending a hand to Oliver. "Then let us begin," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "Together we will find her, and when we do, our family will be whole." Seranna wrapped her arm around Oliver's shoulders, guiding him forward as they moved deeper into the manor. The walls around them seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, the shadows bending to their will as they passed. Oliver felt a surge of strength, a newfound confidence that came from knowing he was no longer alone. As they walked, Eldur spoke of the sister they sought, a young elder who had been lost to the darkness, hidden away by forces that even Eldur and Seranna could not see. But with Oliver's help, they would find her, and they would bring her home. The manor's corridors twisted and turned, but Oliver no longer felt lost. He had found his place among the shadows, and with Seranna and Eldur by his side, he felt the stirrings of a power that was more than just darkness. It was family, it was unity, and it was the promise of a future where he was no longer the frightened boy running through the fog, but a prince in his own right, ready to embrace the night. "Now," Eldur said, his voice filled with purpose, as they reached a grand set of doors at the end of the hall, "let's find your new sister." With a final, shared glance of determination, the doors swung open, and the three elders stepped into the darkness beyond, united in their quest to bring their family together. And as they moved forward, the shadows shifted around them, no longer a place of hiding, but a realm where they could truly belong. Shadows of the Blitz. The streets of London lay cloaked in darkness, only the faint outlines of buildings visible against a smoke-filled sky. The year was 1941, and the Blitz had turned the heart of the city into a war zone. The air was thick with fear, the sound of distant explosions, and the ever-present whine of air raid sirens. People rushed through the streets, their faces strained and eyes wide, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Every flicker of light, every shadow cast on a wall, seemed to carry with it the threat of another attack. In a small house on the eastern side of London, a family huddled together in their tiny living room. The walls were thin, barely enough to keep out the cold, let alone the threat of the war that raged above them. Mary Thompson, a young mother with deep brown eyes and hair tied tightly back in a bun, clutched her 3 children close. Her face, though lined with worry, held a determined calm. Her eldest, Edward, a boy of 14, sat closest to her, his eyes darting nervously to the window. Next to him was Clara, her thin frame trembling with every distant thud of a bomb. And then there was Eliza, the youngest, only 12. Her blue eyes were wide with fear, but filled with a quiet strength that seemed beyond her years. Mary's husband, George, was away fighting the Nazis in some distant part of Europe. She had heard nothing from him in weeks, not since his last letter, now crumpled and worn from being read too many times. The uncertainty of his fate weighed heavily on her heart, but she tried to keep her children reassured, if not hopeful. "Mummy, when will Daddy be back?" Clara asked, her voice small and trembling. Mary stroked Clara's hair and forced a smile. "Soon, darling. Very soon. He promised he would come back to us. But even as she spoke, the doubt in her voice betrayed her. Eliza, sitting a little apart from her siblings, stared out the small window and the darkened sky, her fingers gripping the edge of the curtain tightly. "The planes are coming again, Mum," she whispered. Mary moved quickly, her heart racing. "Into the shelter, now!" Mary commanded. The children scrambled to the small, cramped understairs cupboard they used as a makeshift bomb shelter. The blackout curtains were drawn tight, blocking any light that might betray their presence to the enemy above. Outside, the siren's wail grew louder, and soon the first drone of German bombers filled the air. The terrifying sound grew until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The family clutched one another, eyes wide, breaths held, as they waited for the inevitable. Suddenly, the night exploded with the deafening roar of bombs dropping, a terrifying percussion that seemed to tear the city apart, piece by piece. The house shook violently, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. The sounds were deafening, the whistling of falling bombs, the thunderous explosions, and the shattering of glass. Then, the unthinkable happened. A bomb fell close, too close. The walls groaned, the ceiling cracked, and with a terrible, splintering crash, the house was torn apart. The world went white, and then black. When the dust settled, there was nothing but silence. Mary lay still, her arms still wrapped around Edward and Clara, their faces pale and lifeless beneath her. The little house was in ruins, a heap of shattered wood and brick, the remnants of a family's life scattered across the street. But then, a small sound broke the silence, a faint whimper, a cry. Eliza, covered in dust and blood, slowly pulled herself from beneath the rubble. Her blue eyes were wide with shock and terror, her small frame trembling as she looked around at the devastation. "Mum? Edward? Clara?" she called out, her voice breaking, barely a whisper in the night. But there was no answer, only the distant sounds of war, the faint echo of another explosion far away, and the crackle of flames from burning buildings. Eliza stumbled to her feet, her legs weak and shaking. She stood alone in the cold, dark night of the Blitz, the last survivor of her family. The moon broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over the shattered street. She felt a chill run down her spine, a deep, gnawing fear that she had never known before. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized that everything she had known, everything she had loved, was gone in an instant. London continued to burn around her, the flames reflected in her eyes, but all Eliza could feel was the emptiness, a hollow ache that no tears could fill. She was alone now, in a city torn apart by war, her family taken from her in a flash of fire and fury. She sank to her knees, her small frame racked with sobs, as the city around her burned on into the night. But something stirred within her, a determination, a flicker of strength. She wiped her tears away with a dirty hand and looked up at the sky. "I won't be afraid," she whispered to herself. "Not anymore." And so, in that moment, a new story began for the girl who had lost everything, but who would not be broken. "You there?" A voice cut through the smoke and dust, commanding and sharp. "Come here, girl." Eliza turned her head slowly, her vision still blurred from the blast, and saw a tall, well-dressed man standing amidst the rubble. His suit was immaculate, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. He was thin and gaunt, with a pale complexion that seemed to glow in the moonlight. His eyes, however, were what drew her in. They were dark, almost black, and filled with a strange intensity. She moved towards him, her steps uncertain, her small hands trembling at her sides. The man watched her approach, a thin smile curling on his lips. "Anyone else alive in there?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost soothing. Eliza shook her head, trying to hold back the tears. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My mummy, Edward, and Clara, they're gone." The man's smile widened, a hint of something sinister flickering in his eyes. "So," he murmured, almost to himself, "you are all alone, just like me?" He leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it so happens I have need of an assistant." Before she could react, the man's face transformed. His skin seemed to pull tighter over his sharp bones, his mouth parted to reveal long, gleaming fangs, and his eyes turned a deep blood red. In a flash, he moved, a blur of shadow and speed, and he was upon her. Eliza felt a sharp pain in her neck, like fire coursing through her veins. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The world around her darkened, and her body grew cold, numb. She could feel her heart slowing, her blood draining away. The last thing she saw was the man's eyes, burning like embers in the dark, and then there was nothing but blackness. Time passed. Seconds, minutes, hours. She couldn't tell. There was no sense of place, no sense of self, only a deep, empty void. But then something stirred within her, a flicker of light in the darkness. Her heart began to beat again, slowly at first, then stronger, more powerful. Her lungs filled with air, and she gasped, feeling a rush of something new. Eliza's eyes snapped open, and she bolted upright, a strange strength coursing through her small frame. She felt alive, more alive than she had ever felt before. Her senses were heightened. She could hear the distant sounds of footsteps, the rustling of leaves, even the faint beating of the man's heart nearby. Her vision was sharper, colours more vibrant, and every smell was distinct. The damp earth, the smoke in the air, the metallic tang of blood. "Ah, finally," the man said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. He stood a few feet away, watching her intently. "You have returned." Eliza stared at him, feeling an unnatural hunger gnawing at her insides. What have you done to me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. "I have given you a new life," the man replied, his smile growing. "A life beyond death, a life of power. I am in need of an assistant, you see. Someone small and quick, someone who can go unnoticed, slip through the cracks, take what is needed, and vanish without a trace." He paused, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Like a flea." Eliza felt a strange sensation, a surge of energy, a flicker of exhilaration at his words. She was no longer the frightened girl left alone in the ruins of her home. She was something else now, something more. "Like a flea," she repeated, a faint smile touching her lips. The man chuckled, a low, dark sound. "Yes, my little flea," he said, "that is what you shall be. But you must learn to use your new gifts, to master the shadows and move with the wind. I will train you, teach you everything you need to know." Eliza nodded, the hunger in her eyes growing fiercer. "Teach me," she whispered, feeling the power coursing through her veins, the cold strength of her new form. "I want to learn." And so, the man, her maker, took her under his wing, a dark mentor in a city ravaged by war. He taught her to move unseen, to strike quickly and disappear even quicker. Her small size made her agile, her new strength made her formidable, and her hunger made her relentless. She learned to slip through the shadows, to dance on the rooftops, and to vanish into the night like a whisper on the wind. She became his perfect assistant, his little flea, darting through the streets of London, a tiny deadly shadow, always moving, always unseen, always hungry. And as the bombs continued to fall and the city burned, the flea thrived, her new life just beginning amidst the ashes of the old. Eliza stood outside the entrance to a cave, the shadows deep and foreboding. The air was thick with dampness, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the cool breeze. Her senses were heightened, her every nerve on edge. The tall man, her maker, stood beside her, his dark eyes gleaming with an anticipation that made her uneasy. "That's the one," he whispered, his voice a mere breath in the still night air. "Go inside. When you have it, escape quickly. Do not tarry." Eliza nodded, feeling the pulse of her new, powerful heart quicken with a mixture of fear and excitement. She darted forward, moving through the small openings of the cave entrance, slipping through the narrow gaps with ease. Her small size made her agile, her vampiric nature made her swift. She moved like a shadow, darting past traps and alarms, her instincts guiding her through the darkness. Deeper and deeper she went, her steps light and silent on the cave floor. She could hear the faint echo of water dripping, the sound bouncing off the ancient stone walls. The air grew colder, the darkness thickening around her, but she continued, driven by the command of the tall man and the insatiable hunger that now defined her existence. Finally, she arrived in a large chamber inside the cave, the space illuminated by a dim, otherworldly glow. Strange symbols and markings covered the walls, ancient and cryptic, pulsing with a faint energy that made her skin tingle. At the center of the room, atop a pedestal, lay a stack of books, tomes of knowledge, bound in dark, cracked leather. But one in particular stood out, glowing faintly, its pages edged with gold. This was the book the tall man had sent her to retrieve. Eliza understood now why he had chosen her for this task. She was small, quick, and undetectable, able to slip through the narrowest cracks and blend into the darkest shadows. She moved carefully, her eyes darting around, watching for any movement, any sign of danger. She slipped through the shadows, her breath shallow and quiet. She reached out and grabbed the book, feeling its weight, the ancient energy coursing through it. But as soon as her fingers touched the cover, a deep rumble shook the chamber. Two large figures materialized before her, emerging from the darkness like nightmares given form. They were demonic, terrifying, with horns curling from their heads and eyes glowing like hot coals. Their bodies were covered in scales, their hands ending in razor-sharp claws. They spoke in an unknown tongue, their voices a low, guttural growl that sent chills down her spine. Eliza froze, her body tense with fear. Even as an elder, she felt a jolt of panic shoot through her. These were no ordinary creatures. They were demons, ferocious and powerful, their auras emanating a dark energy that filled the chamber with dread. She remembered the tall man's warning, "Do not engage with them. These demonic creatures are impervious to an elder's power." She knew she had to run. Eliza darted to the side, slipping into the shadows, moving with the speed and agility of a flea. The demons lunged at her, their claws slashing through the air where she had just been. She ducked and weaved, using every inch of her small frame to avoid their attacks. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She moved through the cracks, the narrow passages that only she could navigate, her body a blur in the dim light. The chase was relentless. The demons hot on her heels, their growls echoing off the stone walls. She felt their breath on her neck, their claws just inches away, but she kept moving. slipping through the smallest openings, hiding in the darkest corners, just like a flea. She knew this cave well. She had memorized every turn, every crevice, every hidden path. After what seemed like an eternity, she saw the entrance, the dim light of the outside world calling to her. With a final burst of speed, she leapt out of the cave, landing softly on the damp grass. The tall man was waiting, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance. As soon as he saw her, he grabbed the book from her hands, his expression unreadable. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the ancient text. Then he smiled, a dark, satisfied smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Excellent," he murmured, almost to himself. "This is an ancient tome of knowledge, demonic knowledge. With this, I will become unstoppable." He turned to her, his eyes gleaming with a fierce hunger. "But there are still more items I need you to collect for me, my little flea," he said, his voice dripping with anticipation. "Much more." Eliza nodded, hiding the fear that clawed at her insides. She knew now that she was bound to him, trapped in this new existence, this new life. But somewhere deep inside, a small part of her still remembered the girl she once was, the girl who had known fear and pain, but also love and hope. For now, she would be the flea, darting through shadows, stealing secrets, and serving her dark master. But one day, she would find a way to be free. Years slipped by, like shadows moving through the night, and Eliza had become little more than an instrument in the hands of the tall man. Her existence was marked by long stretches of isolation, broken only by the rare commanding summons of her master. Each time he called, it was to send her on another errand, another mission to retrieve some powerful artifact or ancient relic, each one more dangerous than the last. Eliza had become an expert at moving through the dark. She had stolen from the dens of demons, slipped past the vigilant eyes of lycanthropes, and even eluded other elders, her skills honed to a razor's edge by years of relentless tasks. Her small stature and uncanny speed allowed her to weave through the tightest spaces, to hide in the darkest shadows, to vanish into nothingness. To him, she was the perfect tool, a little flea that could get in and out where others could not. But when the missions ended and the tall man had no use for her, he would cast her aside like a forgotten trinket. She would return to the small, dark corner of the world he allowed her to inhabit, where silence was her only companion, and time seemed to stretch endlessly. Days, weeks, sometimes months would pass without a word, a gesture, or even a hint of acknowledgement from her master. She was left alone, trapped in a cycle of emptiness and waiting. During these times of abandonment, the tall man's neglect felt like a slow poison, eating away at her spirit. She wandered aimlessly through the streets, slipping between the shadows like a ghost, unseen and unnoticed. Her existence was a hollow one, devoid of warmth or meaning. She had no friends, no companions, no one who truly saw her. She was an elder, yes, but not a powerful one, not a revered one, just a lonely creature, used for her peculiar talents, and discarded when she was no longer needed. When she was alone, Eliza often found herself wandering the rooftops of the city, gazing down at the streets below. She watched the people, humans, with their ordinary lives, their petty struggles, their brief joys. She watched mothers with their children, friends laughing together, lovers embracing. She watched them all, longing for what she could no longer have, longing for something she could barely remember. She often wondered what it would feel like to be held, to be loved, to feel the warmth of another's touch. She remembered, faintly, the days when she was human, when she had a mother, a brother, and a sister. But those memories were like faded photographs, blurry and distant, slipping further away with each passing year. Sometimes, When the emptiness grew too much to bear, she would allow herself to feel fear again. She would imagine herself caught by the creatures she was sent to rob, the demons with their fiery eyes, the lichens with their fierce jaws, the elders with their cruel smiles. She imagined them catching her, ending her miserable existence in a flash of violence. She imagined the darkness closing in, the pain searing through her, and she wondered if, perhaps, it would be a release, but even that seemed like a distant dream. She had been an elder for so long now that even death seemed out of reach. She was stuck in this endless twilight, a creature caught between life and death, between shadow and light, forever bound to the whims of the tall man. Every task brought with it a flicker of fear, a small spark of hope that maybe, this time, she would fail, that she would finally meet her end. But each time she succeeded, her instincts taking over, her body moving with a speed and precision she couldn't control. She would return to the tall man with the stolen item in hand, and he would take it from her without a word of thanks, without even a glance. Then he would disappear again, leaving her to her loneliness. Eliza had become a shadow herself, flitting through the world unnoticed, unwanted. She was a tool, nothing more, a means to an end for the tall man, a puppet dancing on invisible strings. Her life had no meaning, no purpose beyond the tasks he set for her. She was trapped in a nightmare that never ended, a darkness that never lifted. Her soul, if she still had one, was a deep well of sorrow. She could not even remember the last time she had felt joy or love or even simple contentment. All she knew was the fear, the pain, the endless waiting. All she knew was the emptiness. And so she waited, as she always did, for the tall man to call again. She waited, wondering if this time perhaps he would send her to her death, wondering if this time she would finally be free from this dark, endless existence, wondering if, somehow, there was still a way for her to find peace. But for now, there was only the darkness. For now, there was only the silence. And so she waited, alone in a world that had forgotten she ever existed. The tall man sat in his darkened chamber, surrounded by the ancient tomes and artifacts he had stolen over the years. He studied each page with an intensity that bordered on obsession, his eyes flickering over forbidden symbols, his fingers tracing lines of arcane script. The room was filled with an otherworldly energy, a strange hum that seemed to pulse from the very walls. He felt the power coursing through him, a power beyond that of any ordinary elder, a power born from knowledge forbidden to his kind. As he turned another page, he suddenly paused, his senses alert. He felt a presence, a familiar, powerful aura that filled the room like a shadow. He did not look up but spoke softly, his voice a mix of amusement and challenge. "No need to hide in the shadows, brother," he said, his smile widening. "We are all family here." From the dark corner of the room, Elder stepped forward, his expression inscrutable. He moved with the grace of a predator, his eyes never leaving the tall man. "To what do I owe this visit, Elder, Slayer of the Master?" the tall man asked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. Elder's voice was calm, almost curious. "I am here to understand why you have abandoned your brothers and now dabble in powers that are not your own, demonic, lycanthropic, forbidden knowledge." The tall man's smile faded, and his eyes narrowed. "What do you care, Elder? You have never been one to follow the rules of the elders." "Indeed," Elder replied, his tone measured. "But I have a concern, a minor one perhaps, but a concern nonetheless." He paused, his gaze piercing. "The flea." The tall man's expression shifted to one of irritation. "She is mine," he snapped. "I will not trade her. What interest could she possibly be to you and Seranna? Go make your own, Elder." Elder's eyes darkened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "Do not speak in such a way to me," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You may think yourself powerful, but you do not know what you are dealing with." The tall man laughed softly, a mocking sound that echoed through the chamber. "Yes, I know you are powerful, Elder. Different. Much more powerful than me, perhaps. But," he leaned forward, his smile returning, a sly, secretive smile, "I have something you do not. Elder, I have knowledge unknown to the elders." With a casual flick of his hand, two large demonic figures emerged from the shadows behind him. They were monstrous, towering creatures with twisted, unnatural forms, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening around them. The tall man's smile widened. "You see, I have mastery over these new allies of mine," he continued. "And as you well know, your powers, no matter how vast, are useless against demonic energy. You would be killed instantly." Elder's expression remained unreadable, but a faint tension tightened his posture. The tall man took a step closer, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "I will not give up my flea. She is mine. And should you come here again, I will not think twice about killing you. Now be gone, Elder." For a moment, there was only silence. Elder stood there, his face a mask of calm, but his mind was racing, searching for answers, calculating possibilities. He gave the tall man a single lingering look, then turned and walked away, his steps silent as the grave. As he left, the tall man watched him with a satisfied grin, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of power. He knew he had struck a nerve, and he relished the thought of keeping Eliza under his control, using her as his tool, his little flea, to gather more knowledge, more power. But deep in Elder's mind, plans were forming. He knew he would need to find a way to counter the tall man's newfound strength, to find a weapon against demonic energy, to understand the knowledge the tall man had gained. For now, he would retreat, but only to gather his strength, to bide his time. The game had changed, but it was far from over. Elder paced back and forth, frustration etched into his face. "He is too powerful," he muttered, almost to himself. "We may have left it too late. The tall man has grown in strength beyond anything I anticipated. I cannot risk sending you in there, Oliver. It is simply too dangerous." Seranna watched him carefully, her face thoughtful. "Are you saying there's nothing we can do?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. Elder paused and looked at her. "I don't see a way," he admitted. "The flea is lost to us, trapped under his control, and I will not sacrifice Oliver to save her." Oliver, standing in the doorway, had been listening quietly, his face pale and tense. "I won't go near the tall man," he said, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Elder, but I just can't. That place, it terrifies me." Elder nodded. "I will not send you in there, Oliver," he reassured him. "But I can feel her pain, just as I felt yours. After my conflict with the Master, something changed in me. I can sense the suffering of other elders, their need, their fear. It eats at me, calls to me." Seranna studied him for a moment, then a light seemed to flicker in her eyes. "Perhaps there is someone who could help us," she suggested. Elder turned to her, intrigued. "Who?" Seranna's lips curled into a knowing smile. "He said you helped him once. He might be willing to help us now," she said. "And isn't he duty-bound to stop any of us from becoming too powerful?" Eldur's eyes widened as he caught her meaning. "Winter," he whispered. "Yes," Seranna nodded. "He might be our only hope." Oliver's face softened with relief. "Winter. He would know what to do," he murmured, a faint hope kindling in his eyes. Eldur thought for a moment, his mind racing. Winter is the only one who could match the tall man's cunning, who could challenge his forbidden knowledge, he said. But finding him, convincing him, that is another challenge. Seranna smiled, her expression almost playful. "I think Winter already knows," she said. "He always seems to know." Eldur sighed, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "Then we must find him," he said resolutely. "For Eliza's sake, and for our own, we must free her before the tall man grows even stronger." "Winter has never failed before," Seranna added, "and I don't think he will fail us now." Eldur nodded. "Let us hope you're right," he said quietly, "because this time we truly have no other option." As they prepared to seek out Winter, a flicker of hope ignited within them, a hope that the man behind the chrome mask would once again defy the odds and come to their aid. They needed him now, more than ever, to bring balance to their world and to save the little flea from the darkness that threatened to consume her. Simon Winter sat alone in his dimly lit room, illuminated only by the soft glow of a computer screen. But this was no ordinary computer. Built with his own hands and mind, this machine was far beyond anything the world had ever known. It was an extension of himself, a device capable of processing information at speeds that defied imagination. His fingers flew over the keyboard with inhuman precision, knowledge flowing through the machine as if it were a living thing, a perfect union between man and machine. He paused, sensing a presence. Without turning his head, Winter spoke calmly. "Hello, Eldur." From the shadows, Eldur stepped forward, his expression guarded. "It has been some time," he replied cautiously. Winter nodded, still facing the screen. "Indeed, it has." Eldur began, explaining the situation with the tall man and his growing power, but his words were tinged with apprehension. He remembered their last encounter vividly, the moment Winter had bested him, outmaneuvered him at every turn. Winter turned in his chair, finally facing Eldur. His eyes were calm, almost amused. "I foresaw this," he said. "I've been aware of the tall man for some time. His hunger for forbidden power has not gone unnoticed." Eldur frowned. "And yet, you did nothing." Winter leaned back, a faint smile on his lips. "I didn't need to. You're already powerful enough to deal with him. You just needed a push. And perhaps a little guidance." Eldur's wariness deepened. "Guidance from you? After everything?" Winter's smile widened. "Yes, Eldur. Despite our differences in the past, your actions allowed reality itself to be reshaped, and for me to be released from its prison. For that, I am grateful." Eldur's suspicion softened, but only slightly. "So, you won't help me directly?" Winter shook his head. "No, I won't, because I believe you and Seranna are more than enough to deal with the tall man. But I can provide you with something that might tip the balance in your favor." Winter reached into a drawer beside him and pulled out a small, metallic device, its surface smooth and polished, with intricate designs carved into its frame. He handed it to Eldur. "A creation of mine," he explained. "It's designed to revert demonic energy back into shadow, where it can be absorbed and harnessed. Use it wisely, Eldur. You can take their power and make it your own. But do not let Seranna use this. She is not strong enough. Only you are. Eldur took the device, examining it closely, feeling the subtle hum of energy within. He turned to leave, but hesitated at the doorway. "Winter," he said, his voice low. "How did you know I would turn out this way? I am an elder, a predator, and a parasite. For centuries, I've been nothing more." Winter looked at him steadily. "No matter who we are, Eldur, how we were born or what we've done, our past is not who we are. We are what we choose to become. I saw greatness in you before you saw it in yourself." Eldur stared at Winter for a moment, as if weighing his words, then nodded. "Very well," he said. "I will do this. I will save the flea and take down the tall man, so you don't have to." Winter smiled again, but his eyes held a deep intensity. "Good luck, Eldur. Remember, the world will be watching." Eldur turned and disappeared back into the shadows, the device clutched tightly in his hand, his mind already racing with possibilities. The tall man's days were numbered, and this time he would make sure of it. Eldur and Seranna sat in the dimly lit room, their expressions tense and contemplative as they discussed the plan. The air was thick with anticipation, a sense of urgency threading through their every word. Oliver stood a short distance away, nervously listening in, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his coat. He had always been there, lurking in the background, eavesdropping on their conversations. But today, something was different. A fire sparked in his eyes, a desire to change the narrative that had long held him captive. "I want to help," Oliver blurted out, his voice a mix of fear and determination. But I'm scared of the tall man. I've always been scared. That's why I hid in that house for so long." Eldur turned slowly, his gaze softening as he looked at Oliver. His voice, usually commanding and fierce, softened with understanding. "Oliver," he began, "our past does not define us. What we were yesterday does not need to be who we are today." Eldur smiled faintly, recalling Winter's words. "A good friend once told me that. Fear is just another obstacle. It does not have to be the reason we stand still." Oliver nodded, a flicker of hope lighting his face. "I will help," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'll do whatever I can." Eldur nodded in approval. "Then let it be done." Seranna's eyes gleamed with fierce determination. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Eldur's arm and looking at Oliver with a rare smile. "As one," she echoed, her voice steady and unwavering. They were a strange trio, a powerful elder, a cunning shadow, and a frightened young boy, but they were united by a common cause, and for the first time, Oliver felt a surge of courage, a sense of purpose. They had a tall man to face, a flea to save, and a reality to protect. And they would do it together, as one. The tall man sat hunched over his desk, his bony fingers tapping rhythmically against a worn book of ancient knowledge. His lips curled into a sly grin as he traced the arcane symbols on the page. He had discovered the whereabouts of another powerful trinket, a necklace once owned by a voodoo princess, a relic now used in ceremonies to raise the dead. Its power, he believed, would elevate him to new heights, making him unstoppable. "Flee!" he called out in a sharp voice that echoed through the chamber. Eliza appeared almost instantly, stepping from the shadows as if born from them. She kept her eyes down, always aware of her place. The tall man looked her over with his usual predatory gaze. "I need this, my little flea," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and command. "This necklace will grant me great power, just as I foresee Elder and his pathetic follower plotting something against me." He gestured to a faded, ancient map spread out on his table. "The trinket is hidden deep within the underground catacombs, lost in time. But beware, it is very dangerous. The followers of the Voodoo clan are fiercely devoted to its secrecy." They moved to the ruins above, a vast open space of old brick and crumbling stonework. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay, the shadows deeper than the night itself. The tall man pointed toward a darkened opening. "There," he said, his voice a hiss, "just as the text describe. Go now, and hurry back. I have no patience for delay." Eliza slipped into the darkness, moving like a wraith through cracks and narrow openings, her small frame perfectly suited for stealth. She navigated the labyrinthine passages with the skill she had honed over the years, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached a large, dimly lit room. At its center, a man sat, his face obscured, engrossed in an ancient book. Eliza's sharp eyes caught a glint of something shiny on a shelf. "The trinket," she thought, her pulse quickening. She moved through the shadows, silent as death, her fingers outstretched, ready to snatch the prize. "Do not be in a rush to return to him, Eliza." The man suddenly spoke, his voice calm but commanding. "He will have his hands full soon enough." Eliza froze, startled. She turned slowly to see the man more clearly, his face covered with a chrome mask. A strange sense of familiarity struck her. "Do not fear," the masked man continued, his tone gentle yet firm. "Some friends will soon come to help you, once they've dealt with the tall man. You are safe here." Eliza's eyes darted to the trinket, still gleaming on the shelf. "And that trinket," the man added, with a quiet laugh, "it is nothing, merely something I set up long ago to feed the wrong information to the tall man, for a day just like this." Confusion washed over her, mingling with a newfound flicker of hope. She stared at the masked man, uncertain but intrigued. The game had changed, and she was no longer just a pawn. Above, in the darkened ruins, the tall man grew restless. His sharp eyes scanned the shadowy entrance to the catacombs below. His fingers twitched with impatience. "Where is she?" he growled, frustration creeping into his voice. "Fancy seeing you here." Eldur's voice cut through the thick silence like a blade. "What a coincidence," Seranna added, her tone dripping with mockery. The tall man's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed into a sly smile. "You are no match for me," he sneered, his confidence unshaken. "But come, try if you wish to meet your doom." With a flick of his wrist, the tall man summoned two demonic figures from the ground. They rose, their bodies engulfed in hellish flames, their eyes glowing with infernal power. The tall man smiled wider, his arrogance palpable. "Come, slayer of the master," he taunted Elder. "When I defeat you, I will take the title of the most powerful Elder." From the shadows, a timid voice called out, "No, you're just a bully." The tall man turned sharply, his attention drawn to the small figure emerging from the darkness. "You!" he spat, recognizing Oliver. Taking advantage of the distraction, Elder activated Winter's creation. The device glowed faintly, then burst into a radiant light. Within moments, the demonic flames around the two figures flickered and began to shift. They transformed from searing fire to dark, malleable shadows. Elder swiftly moved forward, merging with them, absorbing their infernal energies into himself. His body seemed to pulse with newfound power. "What is this?" the tall man shouted in disbelief. "This is not possible!" Seranna moved quickly, seizing him from behind. "You have no idea what is possible," she hissed into his ear. Elder approached, his form shimmering with the dark energies he had absorbed. The tall man managed to wrench himself free from Seranna's grip, but Elder was upon him in an instant. They clashed, two elders battling in the dim light of the ruins. Elder moved with a grace and speed that belied his size, his strikes powerful and unrelenting. The tall man fought back with all his might, but Elder's newfound strength overwhelmed him. The fight raged on, each blow echoing through the empty space, but it became clear that Elder had the upper hand. With a final surge of energy, Elder landed a decisive blow that sent the tall man sprawling to the ground. The tall man lay on the cold stone floor, defeated and unmoving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Oliver stepped forward, standing over his fallen tormentor. He looked down at the tall man, his small frame seeming to grow in stature as he spoke. "I feared you my whole life," Oliver began, his voice steady and strong. "You stopped me from being who I am because of the fear you caused me. But now you are not so tall. I am tall. I will never let fear stop me from doing what I want to do again." The tall man's eyes widened in shock, a flicker of realization crossing his face, and then slowly he began to fade, his body dissolving into the shadows, his form melting into the eternal darkness. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Within moments, he was gone, vanished forever into the endless shadows of eternity. Oliver stood tall, a quiet determination in his eyes. Eldur approached him, a hint of a smile on his lips. "Well done, Oliver," he said softly. "You stood up to your fear. You are taller than he ever was." Oliver nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I'm not afraid anymore," he whispered, his voice filled with newfound courage. The shadow of the tall man was no more, and in its place stood a stronger, braver Oliver, a testament to the power of overcoming fear. Final chapter. The man in the mask. As Elder, Seranna and Oliver stood together in the stillness, they suddenly heard the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. Their eyes turned to the source, and there, across the dim expanse, stood Winter, with Eliza by his side. "I'll take my device now, Elder," Winter said, his voice calm and commanding. "I have much to do, so I must not delay." Seranna, her body tense with the memory of their past encounters, spoke up, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and fear. "You set all this up. It took all our resources to figure out where the tall man would go next." Winter smiled faintly, nodding. "Yes, and you're welcome. I fed you that information so you would be here at the right moment." He paused, then looked directly at Seranna. "Seranna, you've changed so much, just like Elder. You don't have to fear me. In fact, I'd like to think I can count on your family, should I ever need help." Seranna straightened, her posture shifting from fear to pride. "Yes, of course," she replied with newfound confidence. Winter's smile widened, just a little, before he vanished into the shadows, using the same abilities the elders wielded, leaving only a whisper in the air. Elder and Seranna turned to Eliza, who stood there, her eyes cast downward, still wary and uncertain. "Look up, Eliza," Elder said gently, stepping closer. "You never have to look down again. Come, meet your brother." Oliver, peeking from behind Elder, offered a tentative smile. "Hello," he said softly. Eliza's lips curled into a small smile. "I have been alone for so long." Elder nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know," he said. "I could feel you. Your pain called out to me every second of the day, but now I sense a change, a happiness." "Yes, my child," Seranna added, placing a comforting hand on Eliza's shoulder. "We elders can know happiness. It's something we choose, something we fight for." Eliza looked between them, her smile widening, tears welling in her eyes. "Who was that man in the mask?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Eldur glanced at Seranna, then back at Eliza. "Him?" Eldur replied, a hint of reverence in his tone. "He is the one who saved us." Eliza nodded, as if understanding something far deeper than words could convey, and for the first time in many years, she felt a sense of belonging, of hope, and of family. The end.